Hello everybody. This week's Torah portion is Parshas Tazria. At the beginning of the Parsha, the Torah talks about the mitzvah to give a bris milah, to give a circumcision. I want to share with you an incredible story from the Talmud that deals with the mitzvah of circumcision as well as the power and the importance of kindness. So, we know that the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in the year 70. But that wasn't the end of the story. Approximately, in the year 130, there was a very successful attempt to overthrow the Romans. That attempt was led by a man named Bar Kokhba. For a while he was very successful, he was a great general, but because of very serious character flaws, eventually failed, and he was destroyed and defeated. The emperor of Rome at the time was Hadrian. While he's known in world history as a good Roman general, for the Jewish people he was extremely cruel and barbaric. And he led what was called the Hadrianic persecutions. For a long time the Jews were really persecuted by Hadrian. Hadrian, seeing that the Torah and the mitzvos were the source of this Jewish rebellious spirit against Rome, he forbade many Jewish practices. He forbade the study of Torah, among them he also forbade the practice of circumcision. Nonetheless, Jews still did their best under these conditions to avoid the authorities and still practice their religion, but it was very difficult. Many Jews were killed and martyred during this time. The chief rabbi, the Nasi in Israel at the time, was Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, a very famous Jewish scholar. And he was the chief rabbi, and he had a son. He had a son that was born to him. And the law of the time was, it was forbidden to get a circumcision. And everyone wanted to know, would the chief rabbi listen and obey this law forbidding circumcision? And not bowing to the pressure, defiantly, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, on the 8th day, gave his son a bris milah and named his son Yehuda. When the emperor heard of this defiance, it wasn't enough to simply have a subordinate punish Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. He summoned that he personally come to Rome to explain his behavior directly to the emperor. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and his wife and son very fearfully boarded a boat to travel to Rome. Now, we don't know the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's wife, but she is the heroine of the story. We'll call her Mrs. Ben Gamliel. Mrs. Ben Gamliel apparently was a kind and gracious person. And on the boat, she befriended another woman aristocrat. And she was a woman. She was a woman, a Roman woman. And they became friendly. And in the course of their relationship, this Roman aristocrat asked Mrs. Ben Gamliel, what is the reason for her trip? She explains her husband is the chief rabbi of the Jewish people, and they performed a circumcision on their son against the law, against the Roman decree, and they're being summoned to personally appear in front of Hadrian to explain their behavior. So this woman kindly said, "You can't do that. He'll execute you in a second." She said, "What should I do?" He said, "Do the following. I have a son, baby, just about the same age as yours. When you approach the emperor, before you approach the emperor, I want to switch babies. For a little while, for a couple of days, I will take your son, and you take my son. And when you approach the emperor, approach with my son, who doesn't have a circumcision, and you'll be able to save your life." That's what they did. Before Mrs. Ben Gamliel and her husband approached the emperor, they switched babies. For a little while, Mrs. Ben Gamliel raised and nurtured this Roman aristocrat's child. For a little bit, she raised Yehuda, the son of Shimon ben Gamliel's child. And they timidly approached the emperor. And the emperor roared at them and said, "How dare you defy my orders?" Rabbi Weiner said, "Your Highness, there must be some mistake. Look at this child. Does he have a circumcision?" The child was inspected. Indeed, there wasn't. And the emperor sent them away. So the kindness of this aristocrat and the kindness of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's wife ultimately led to Yehuda's life being spared, as well as Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's life being spared. This little Yehuda eventually grew up to become the famous Yehuda HaNasi. Yehuda Nasi eventually became known as the chief, the next Nasi, another important chief rabbi of the Jewish people at the time. But who was that little Roman baby that Mrs. ben Gamliel raised for a little bit? That baby eventually grew up to become Antoninus, who history records was Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a famous Stoic philosopher and emperor. He was an enlightened emperor, and our sages say Antoninus and Yehuda Nasi, those two babies who switched places, became close friends, close associates. And even though before Yehuda Nasi's time, there was this great period of persecution. When Antoninus became the emperor, there was this period of relaxed decrees against the Jews. Jews experienced tranquility and a merciful attitude towards them. And because of Marcus Aurelius' benevolence toward the Jewish people, that allowed the codification of the Mishnah. The Mishnah, which is the core of the Torah Shebaal Peh, which ultimately is the foundation of the Talmud. So it was Mrs. ben Gamliel's kindness that led to the writing of the Mishnah, ultimately the codification of the Talmud. What happened to Marcus Aurelius? Because of the influence that Yehuda Nasi's mother had on him, he became a great person. The Talmud records how they had this great friendship with Yehuda Nasi. They often would study together. He expresses his great intent to convert, and there's a question over whether he eventually succeeded. One authority in the Talmud says he was dissuaded and he was convinced by Yehuda Nasi to stay an enlightened non-Jewish Ben Noach. But others say he actually secretly converted to Judaism. Marcus Aurelius actually wrote a book called Meditations. And if one looks at this book, it's fascinating how there's so many parallels between Meditations and Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos, part of the Mishnah, which is written by Yehuda Nasi, it's a book of ethics, has so many parallels in Meditations, and it's really clear that Marcus Aurelius was inspired and drew from Jewish sources. So the lesson of the story is that the kindness and sweetness of Mrs. ben Gamliel ultimately led to the great salvation of the Jewish people, and even today we reap the benefits of that sweetness and kindness. Have a beautiful Shabbos. Let's all remember these important lessons. Take good care.